Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone who came out tonight and the North Dakota winner here in Bismarck. And I want to thank BeTruthful.org for inviting me out here to speak. I love coming out away from the Washington, D.C. area where I unfortunately spend a lot of my time, or I love going away from these UN climate summits, which I've been attending now since the first one I went to was the 2002 not Rio, but the South African Earth Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I've been to almost every single one since then. The UN always goes to all these exotic locations. But I come to you not as a scientist, but as an investigative reporter. And what I like to say is I'm not a scientist, but I play one on TV occasionally. And that was fun debating Bill Nye. I actually got to do it 3 different times. Once on John Stossel, once on CNN, and once interviewed him for the film. Which is where he said, by the way, he thought it was a reasonable thing to look into jailing climate skeptics for affecting his way of life, which is incredible. But I've spent my career, started out with Rush Limbaugh's television show, and I was his man in Washington. So as his man in Washington, I would go into Washington, D.C., and I would cover the animal rights marches and the Earth Day marches and a lot of other marches. I remember interviewing people at the Animal Rights March. And there were people back, this is 1992, 93, who wanted to ban the building of new roads because of the amount of roadkill in society. I mean, so there's been this, and what's shocking is watching this over the last 30 years, is these extreme elements have now become mainstream for the activists on all across the entire spectrum on species, climate, environment, energy. I always joke that the animal rights activists who wanted to stop new road building was actually somewhat of a moderate, because others probably wanted to tear down existing roads. But they were actually, this is what came to Washington. So I took it as an investigative journalist to cover the other side that the media didn't cover. So I did an Amazon rainforest documentary in the 1990s, which was called Clear Cutting the Myths. And I went to Brazil, interviewed top scientists there. They were throwing down the propaganda, the guidebooks to Brazil, saying this is all BS. Amazon was not lungs of the earth. Even the New York Times admitted a few years later that for every acre of rainforest cut, 50 acres are being regenerated. That used to be the scare before climate change. You had Sting's Rainforest Concert, National Geographic. It was all about the forest about to disappear. And it turns out the Amazon is nearly the most intact forest. And people are leaving the jungles now, and they have new forestry techniques, sustainable forestry, where they can cut logs down and do it in a way where within 7 years you can't distinguish the plant and animal species. So technology, innovation, natural cycles, people moving. It's just amazing how once thought of environmental doom fades away. So from there, I ended up becoming on the climate beat. Started that about 20 years ago as an investigative reporter. Started going to the UN climate summits, and of course I worked for the US Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And what happened there was with Senator James Inhofe, who was a leader in fighting this whole climate movement. This was back when George Bush was president, and then President Obama's first term, when he was pushing the cap and trade, which is a fancy style of carbon taxes. Senator Inhofe was almost virtually alone in the US Senate. He was the point man, and he stood against the whole tidal wave of that. And we were able to defeat it, but not just defeat that in a way. We were able to get senators like Al Franken to oppose Obama's cap and trade. We were able to get about 7 or 8 key Democrats in Rust Belt states to oppose it. And Harry Reid never even introduced the climate bill from President Obama for a vote in the Senate. And that was an amazing thing to watch. So from there, I went on and did Climate Depot. My book came out last spring, March of 2021, Green Fraud, Why the Green New Deal is Worse Than You Think. One of the reasons the Green New Deal is even worse than you think is because of what's happened with lockdowns for COVID. And I'm going to talk about that tonight. The left seized on that. At first they were jealous, then they wanted in on it. The foreword is by Marc Stein in this book, and the book is worth getting just to read Marc Stein's foreword. He's hilarious. So I'm going to start with a little basic background on just the basic climate science. In talking to many UN scientists, I've done special reports just interviewing and focusing on former United Nations scientists who turned against the UN. Some are still current, and they talk about how the UN literally has bastardized the science, exaggerated for extreme ends. The UN Climate Panel is a self-serving group that if it fails to find climate alarming, they fail to have a reason to exist. So just as background, scientists note that geologically speaking, the Earth is in a CO2 famine. In other words, 90% of Earth's history, CO2 levels have been higher, and it's also been colder. In fact, we're in actually the 10% coldest of Earth's history, so 90% of Earth's history was too warm to have ice at either pole. We've had ice ages with many times higher CO2. So one of the first things I did was go to Ivy League. I interviewed an Ivy League geologist, Dr. Robert Giegengak, who literally explained that CO2 is not the control knob of the climate. There's nothing in the data record that speaks for it. But people say, what about Al Gore's film? This is a screenshot of Al Gore's film. He's showing you these high CO2 levels to scare you. And he's showing you a small snapshot of the Earth's geologic history, going back hundreds of thousands of years, or tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years here. But what he's leaving out is if you go back further and look at the Earth, that's Al Gore's high point. And that's what I'm talking about when we're at the 10%. 90% of Earth's history has had higher CO2 levels. Princeton physicist Will Happer, who's one of the premier experts on the greenhouse effect, has actually said Earth is in a CO2 famine. He testified to the United States Senate on that. This is a government chart, actually available from NOAA, still on government websites, shows you the global temperature over the last 500 years. And you can see where we are now, again, supporting what I'm saying. I use mainstream sources. I will show you Al Gore, I will show you NOAA, I will show you UN data, I will show you government data. Not some people always say, oh, he's referring to an obscure blog. No, this is a NOAA actual scientific chart. This is actually a great illustration. The way they try to show the temperature rise of the last 150 years, if people say, is climate change real? Yes. If you look at the last 150 years, the Little Ice Age ended in 1850. We have warmed since the end of the Little Ice Age when New York Harbor was frozen over. Greenpeace co-founder Patrick Moore did this chart, which just shows you if you actually look at it at a normal scale of temperature, it's a barely noticeable rise in temperature. But what they try to do is hype 1/10 of a degree or 100ths of a degree when they declare the hottest year on record. They literally have differences in temperature year to year that are within the margin of error, but they hype it as though it's somehow meaningful and the Earth is going to die and boil. It's a fancy way of saying the temperature hasn't changed much at all. This is my favorite quote to explain the skeptical position on climate change. It's governed by hundreds of factors or variables. The idea we can manage it by understanding and manipulating at the margins one politically selected factor, carbon dioxide, is as misguided as it gets. It's scientific nonsense. Now, when I said earlier is have we warmed? We've warmed since 1850. We've warmed since the 1970s cooling, but government data shows that if we started out, if you're 1990, they had said the Earth, that the global temperatures had actually cooled since the early part of the 1920s, 30s. They go back and that government has actually changed past historical records, but you can actually look at old government reports, and we'll talk about that a little, that show you the temperatures they used to have, the 1930s much warmer. They've cooled the past to show a warming trend. But if you look at it, the medieval warm period, as warm or warmer than today. The Roman warming period, or about 0 AD, as warm or warmer than today. So if someone says, is the temperatures warming? It depends on your scale. Since the Roman warming period, probably cooled slightly. Since the medieval warming period, about 1000 AD, probably about the same temperature. And these are peer-reviewed studies. In my first book, Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate, I go a whole chapter explaining all the peer-reviewed science. And again, I quote New York Times. I quote mainstream sources to show you what's happening. This is the National Academy of Science, 1975. The climate of the Earth has always been changing. It will continue to do so. How large these changes will be and where and how rapidly they will occur, we do not know. So what they want you to believe is that in the last 50 or so years, they've been able to magically refine everything, even though in the 1970s, there were many sources worried about man-made global cooling. One of the things they do to get people silenced, and this is sort of what we've seen with COVID. In other words, if you disagree with Anthony Fauci, you are a misinformer, you will be shut down, deplatformed, silenced, and censored. Well, what they did here is 97% consensus. You'll hear Al Gore claim 99%, 98%. It was based on surveys of 77 anonymous scientists. We don't know their names, affiliation. They asked a question most skeptical scientists would agree with. Essentially, is Earth warming, and have humans contributed to it? 97% was not even 97 scientists. Another one, I interviewed a UN lead author who looked at another 97% consensus claim. He said the claim of 97% of scientists agreeing with man-made climate change is essentially pulled from thin air, not based on any credible research. Of course, the United Nations loves this stuff. 1972, UN environment boss, we have 10 years to stop catastrophe. 1982, an environmental catastrophe as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust. 1990, we shall win or lose the climate in the first years in 1990s. 1989, the UN issued a 10-year climate tipping point. And of course, AOC, Ocasio-Cortez, issued her 12-year climate tipping point in 2019. I did a whole special report on this. It's in my book as well. The Earth is serially doomed, the official history of climate tipping points. And it actually goes back to 1864, earliest known climate tipping point. George Perkins Marshall warned of climatic excess unless men changed their ways. And this is how it goes. Prince Charles issued a 100-month tipping point in about 2009 or 10. And he literally counted it down, 88 months, 60 months, 30 months. And when he got to zero, he erased it and then put a tipping point, I think it's 2047 or 2045 now. They just erase it and come up with a new deadline as needed. But see, there's some of the predictions. Before climate, there was, again, mentioned Amazon and deforestation. 1970 was the overpopulation scare. They were warning 4 billion people would perish in the great die-off. So my question is, anyone old enough here to remember, did any of you perish in this great die-off predicted by the environmental alarmist Paul Ehrlich? And I do see a hand over there. I don't know how that, someone did perish. No one perished in that. 2006, Gore said we had 10 years left. And of course, 2019, AOC. If you want to know what your kids are being taught at college, this is a peace professor, it's not a clue right there, something's weird, but Professor Michael Clare of Hampshire College wrote this in Salon magazine, and he warned, if Earth continues heating at its exponential rate, our post-apocalyptic fantasies could become everyday realities. This is the fear. Now, I'm going to try to read this as he would have intended, the professor. We envision rising temperatures, prolonged droughts, freakish storms, hellish wildfires, rising sea levels, food riots, mass starvation, state collapse, mass migrations, conflicts of every sort leading up to, including full-scale war. COVID could prove even more disruptive and deadly. Persistent drought and hunger will force millions of people to abandon their traditional lands and flee to the squalor of shanty towns. That's the prediction of what's going to happen under this post-apocalyptic climate apocalypse. And now the United Nations loves this kind of climate fear, but if you scratch it, this is the new report, just came out this August. A IPCC lead author named Jim Cosin also sells extreme climate model scenarios. So this is good for his business. And look at his stated motivation. This is the mainstream media reporting. I think that people are more and more starting to get scared of climate change. I think that'll help to change people's attitude, the IPCC report, and hopefully it'll affect the way they vote. So you're being admitted by a UN lead author of a climate report that he hopes the report will change the way you vote, and he hopes you get scared, and he admits that he's making money off of this by selling his scary climate scenarios. The UN essentially says, give us trillions or you will fry. There will be storms, floods, droughts, winds, pestilence, and we really mean it this time, pay here. This is a great report. It's literally like that. It's a hostage situation, like a mob informant coming in to your neighborhood and saying, if you don't pay the protection fee, something bad could happen to your storm. They're basically saying, if you don't support a UN climate treaty, something bad is going to happen. I, of course, go back. Rod Serling never actually said this in The Twilight Zone, but imagine, if you will, a world where people believe the temperature of the planet can be controlled by giving more money to the government, because that's literally what their premise is. Chuck Schumer just recently said on the Senate floor, everyone knows these hurricanes wouldn't be so bad if we had done more on climate. That's the equivalent to saying everyone knows those crops failed because those witches weren't put on trial and put to death. It's the same concept. They actually believe that they can vote something in the United States Senate or sign on to some UN agreement that doesn't even affect global emissions, by the way, and have some kind of temperature change and or storm changed. What's weird about it is we're always asked to continually save the planet. Secretary of John Kerry, 2015, declared victory, as did the UN climate chief, as did President Obama. But here's an example. This is a tremendous victory, the UN Paris Agreement, for all citizens, not for one country, but a victory for all people and future generations. Problem is, a year later, what happened? We had to save the planet all over again. It wasn't enough. And here's an example. At every UN, this goes back to Rio Earth Summit, 1992, which got us into this mess, which unfortunately was under George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father. 1992, they signed the Rio Treaty. It starts this UN climate process. This is global CO2 emissions. Every United Nations summit, every year since then. And guess what's happened? CO2 has continued to rise, no matter all the rhetoric, all the declarations of victory, all the things about our grandchildren will thank us after Copenhagen, after Kyoto, after Paris. This is what they do, but nothing ever changes. So no matter what happens, CO2 you know is going up, and you know they're going to declare victory, but we know we're going to have to save it again, the planet again. Some of the data here, I'll just go quickly through this. This is the wildfires. You can see how they peaked in the 1930s and have gone down dramatically. And wildfires are not a good measure of climate anyway, because it has to do with land use, resource allocation, the way people move, the way they have fire suppression, all sorts of policies. And it's interesting because even President Trump got railed on by the media for saying it was forest management that caused a lot of California's wildfires. And later, California's forestry management admitted that. But it's not a good metric, but even if you were going to use wildfires, you can see where there's no data to support any kind of climate signal. The United Nations admits that on hurricanes, floods, droughts, tornadoes, wildfires, on climate timescale, there's either no trend or declining trend, or no confidence in any trend. This is drought conditions in the United States, global droughts, either no trend or declining trends in peer-reviewed literature. 200-year drought. This is California where it is now. See the little red blip? Look at the past history of California's droughts, or the American West droughts. And this was in, I believe, the San Jose Mercury News, and from an academic publication. But you can see where, if you're worried about droughts, it's not there. There's nothing current happening. Floods, no matter how you measure it. Hydrology journals showing no trend, declining trends in floods. Someone said, hurricanes, maybe more CO2 will equal less severe storms. But as CO2 has risen, severe weather has actually dropped on climate timescales. That includes hurricanes. No matter what year, you can always find bad hurricanes, but we are actually on a global hurricane frequency and also strength is either no trend, declining trend going back. If you look at the big tornadoes, you can see they peaked in the 1970s. If you go back even in the 1950s, still dramatic decline. More tornadoes than ever because they can now count tornadoes. They can count funnel clouds and F1, small tornadoes, with better monitoring of satellites and Doppler radar. But here's something interesting. When I was at the Bali Climate Summit, John McCain's climate aide, John McCain was co-sponsoring a climate bill, was telling everyone in 2007 that we're going to start tying all extreme weather to climate. And everyone was like, that's ridiculous. There's no science. But look at this. This is the New York Times mention of extreme weather. Suddenly, right around the time of that Bali Climate Summit, 2007, mentions of extreme weather in the New York Times shot through the roof. This was an agenda of politics, not science. They changed the narrative. The media fell along with it. We've heard so much of this alarm before. This is 1939. Greenland's glaciers melting, says scientists. Glacier National Park, this is May 2019. They had a sign up saying the glaciers will be gone by 2020. Oops, 2020 came, the glaciers weren't gone. They quietly removed the signs. It wasn't until a couple people started noticing and they had a lot of fun with it. But this is just one of those things where they're so certain that they have everything, and they give you the tipping point deadline, it passes, and then they try to move on. This is a premier scientist from Europe. I find the doomsday picture that Al Gore gives entirely without merit. And this is a great quote. I protest vigorously the idea that the climate reacts like a home heating system to a changed setting of a thermostat. Just turn the dial and the desired temperature will soon be reached. This is interesting because polar bears have been one of the biggest issues. Al Gore's film featured it. Kids have been terrified with it. I'm going to show you some of the kids' indoctrination. I'm going to show you a clip of my film here from Climate Hustle, which we did, Climate Hustle 2, which we just released last year, or 2020 now. But it has kids joining up polar armies, but fat, healthy polar bears prompt Gore to use it. Gore made the polar bear the poster boy of his first film, 2006. His sequel comes out 2017, his book comes out, no mention of polar bears. Why? Because they were at or near historic population highs. Polar bears are disappearing, but only from Al Gore's books and movies. But they'll still say it's worse than we thought for polar bears, the climate activists. They'll say our climate predictions of the year 2100 are much worse than they were just 5 years ago. So when current reality fails to alarm, they make scarier and scarier predictions of the future. It's a deflection. Rain used to be caused by global cooling, but is now caused by global warming. This is in 1974 Time magazine. Look what they highlighted here. 1972, record rains in parts of U.S. and Pakistan forced the worst flooding in centuries. First of all, there's always bad weather. It's always extreme weather. But they're using it as an example. They thought that man-made global cooling was causing aerosols from our fossil fuels, blocking the sun, causing global dimming, lowering the temperature to the point where they wanted to put soot on the Arctic to prevent it from, to speed up its melting. But they were blaming bad weather and on global cooling at the time, and they were also saying global cooling was a national security threat, the same way they're trying to claim climate change was. And this is the Newsweek edition. What's interesting is they had tipping points in the 1970s. Climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action. In other words, they concede that the solution's melting the Arctic ice cap. They're worried that we won't take the action in time to save us, and that was global cooling. National Academy of Science at the time, CO2 was not the whole story despite increasing production. The ever-increasing burning of our fossil fuels, the temperature trend reversed. This is an actual chart, global temperatures, 1975, National Academy of Science, showing that they were documenting global cooling. If you look at these same charts now, they've revised the past to show that this never really happened. They show like a flat line, and then they show current temperatures warmer. The UN Climate Panel, this is a great quote if you're ever wondering what it's about, purely political body posing as a scientific institution. It was formed in 1988. This was set up to look at whether CO2 was causing a climate catastrophe. If the United Nations Climate Panel failed to find it, they failed to have a reason to exist. So of course they found CO2 as a climate catastrophe, and as a bonus, they get to be in charge of the solution with UN Paris agreements and all sorts of annual conferences all over the globe. This was the top UN official, co-chair of the working group. We, the UN IPCC, redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that climate policy is environmental policy. It has almost nothing to do with environmental policy. If any of you are doubting that the climate UN Paris Agreement is about saving the planet, the UN admits it. Now, this was not admitted in some high profile. This was one of the policy wonks talking in a long interview, and this created quite a storm at the time because they were actually saying the quiet part out loud. Now, here's something to be afraid of. As the Omicron variant spreads, countries mull a radical pandemic treaty. Right now, globally, the World Health Organization is using the United Nations Climate Panel as a model to set up essentially a virus pandemic climate virus panel like modeled after the UN IPCC. Annual conferences, countries signing on, a global one-size-fits-all to a pandemic or future virus. Be afraid, be very afraid. That's what's coming on there. Other motives, this is the Greta advisor, Greta Thunberg's advisor, UK environmentalist George Monbiot. We've got to go straight to the heart of capitalism and overthrow it. They're very open. This was said on a UK television show. This is a major environmentalist in England. They admit that's what they're doing. So right now I'm going to show you a clip of all these people from Hollywood and everyone else who advocate all these restrictions on everyone else on climate. We have a Hollywood hypocrisy segment that we're going to show here from the film Climate Hustle 2, came out in fall of 2020, stars Kevin Sorbo as the host, and I'm the climate reporter in it. So if you have that clip ready, this is the Hollywood hypocrisy section.
Ladies and gentlemen, the thrice-nominated Leonardo DiCaprio and Vice President Al Gore.
If the climate change cause could be embodied in one person, it would be Al Gore.
I'm very proud to be standing next to such an inspirational leader in the fight against global warming.
As the verifiable spokesman for the movement, Al Gore has campaigned for people to drastically reduce their carbon footprint. But does he practice what he preaches?
You yourself have a large carbon footprint.
Yeah, well, I don't have a private jet.
That is a G-2B aircraft, one of the most fuel-inefficient private jets on the market today. And that is the former vice president getting off that plane Now he tells us that the Earth is in peril. He wants us to bicycle to work.
And what the carbon emissions come from my trips on Southwest Airlines are offset. I live a carbon-free lifestyle to the maximum extent possible.
Maximum extent possible. That someone doesn't seem to extend to his residence in Tennessee, as Marc of the Clear Energy Alliance explains.
He put 33 280-watt solar panels on his roof and, among other improvements, installed geothermal. Guess what? 10 years later, Al Gore is an even bigger energy hog. Gore is burning up not 20, but 34 times the electricity than the national average. Gore uses so much electricity, all those solar panels provide less than 6% of his power consumption.
Are they willing to live within what they're prescribing?
Well, you know, they're the elites. We're the proletariat. They decide what we, but it doesn't apply to them, and we all know that.
And the United Nations Messenger of Peace, Mr. Leonardo DiCaprio.
Next to Al Gore, there have been few who have been more outspoken about climate change than actor Leonardo DiCaprio.
If you do not believe in climate change, you do not believe in facts or in science or empirical truths, and therefore, in my humble opinion, should not be allowed to hold public office. The solutions we seek require all of us to make real changes in the way we live our lives.
You've taken personal action. Tell me about some of the changes you've made in your day-to-day life.
I try to live a green lifestyle, quote unquote. I mean, I've done the things that I can do in my house to make my house green, energy efficient appliances. I drive a hybrid car. I have solar panels.
But despite his public claim to live a green lifestyle, DiCaprio also seems to practice a double standard, such as when he took a private jet an extra 8,000 miles just to collect an environmental award.
But get this, the Hollywood star's own jet set lifestyle appears to reveal a slight double standard. DiCaprio, who is believed to own at least 4 homes, reportedly taking at least 20 trips across America and around the world this year alone, usually on private jets, which use a lot of fuel. And get this summer, DiCaprio spending time on the 5th largest yacht in the world, a big boat, wouldn't you know, rented from a Middle East oil tycoon.
But does his personal lifestyle, jet-setting around in yachts and planes, mean that he is a hypocrite? Though DiCaprio may be responsible for 500 times the emissions as the average Joe, it's a blip in terms of the effect on global temperature.
But the boat throws me over the edge. That yacht is...
The yacht. But remember, he doesn't own the yacht. He rents the yacht.
But he does. But isn't he talking out one side of his mouth, though, if
that's
he's
what I'm
doing
saying,
that?
because to me, it's like me promoting weight loss and eating a cheeseburger. You can't do all of that. You have to practice what you preach, and people follow by example. So be an example.
All right, that was a little clip of the film, and we go into a bunch of other. Barbara Streisand, by the way, ended up flying, big climate activist, one of the first ones to declare a climate emergency, flew her 3 dogs to a concert in Paris, and I believe it was a private jet, just to come over to be with her in Europe. And these are the climate activists. So what we're finding is this total double standard. UN climate chiefs, environmentalists. Arnold Schwarzenegger, amazingly, took a private jet every day to work when he was governor and signed the big climate bill in California. On Earth Day, he urged Californians to hang their clothes out on air dry on clothes hangers while he himself was commuting via private jet every day to the governor's mansion. By the way, he wouldn't live in the governor's mansion because Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor's mansion in Sacramento, was a step down from his private residence. So he actually lived at home and commuted every day through the jet. So it's an amazing thing. This is what the climate activists all do. And also, we get into Greta Thunberg, who said that she didn't know how she was going to get to the UN climate summit because she didn't know how to get across the ocean because she didn't want to fly. And someone had suggested, well, there's a thing that the Wright brothers helped invent called an airplane. You could fly it. But instead, she took a yacht made of carbon fiber, plastics, and petroleum, and the crew ended up flying back and forth to do it. It was a big virtue signaling media show that had absolutely no ability to reduce emissions, and that got huge, no scrutiny from any of the media. The media covered it as though she was making this big sacrifice. Meanwhile, the crew was flying, and she was flying in a yacht made from fossil fuels. So this is what the agenda is. They want to restrict us, and we're going to get a little deeper. Now, the state of settled science, I'm going to have some fun with this. Predict both outcomes, and you are always right. I mentioned earlier about the climate models and how the global cooling had, they blamed extreme weather on man-made global cooling. Now they blame extreme weather on man-made global warming. Well, this is the state of the settled science right now. This is a whole series of newspapers. Russia's warming faster than the average of the rest of the planet. The mountains are warming faster. Singapore's warming faster. Spain is warming faster. Australia. Almost every place in the globe is warming faster than average. It almost makes you wonder, what's the average if every place is running faster? And there are so many examples of this all the time. It's all statistical chicanery. They can make this up however they want, different baselines, different temperatures. But here's the bottom line. They will tell you, climate change causes less rain. Climate change causes more rain, but less water. Climate change means less snow. Climate change means more snow. Climate change causes Antarctica to lose land ice. Climate change causes Antarctica to gain land ice. Climate change causes duller autumn leaves. Climate change causes more colorful autumn leaves. This is science. Climate change makes for saltier seas. Climate change makes for less salty seas. Again, this is all peer-reviewed scientific studies, many of them by UN scientists. Climate change increases spread of malaria. Climate change decreases spread of malaria. Dengue fever outbreaks increase with climate change. Climate change could decrease the dengue fever risk. More lightning. The US will see 50% more lightning strikes thanks to global warming. But wait, lightning strikes could drop by 15% as climate change causes global temperatures to soar. Get ready for foggier summers. Climate change makes San Francisco foggier. But wait, climate change can also make San Francisco less foggy. Climate change causes more hurricanes, except when climate change causes less hurricanes. They'll be more powerful, they'll be fewer but more powerful, so it's claimed. Obesity causes climate change, but wait, climate change causes starvation. This is getting confusing. Climate change will both increase and decrease fertility. They're just giving up at this point. Whatever happens with fertility, you can rest assured climate change caused it. Beavers, are they good or bad? Climate change, beavers may be making the effects of climate change worse, but hold on, beavers are humanity's natural ally in combating climate change. And you look at this, one article, one study is 2017, the other is 2018. They don't even care to pretend. They just crank the money to academia, just cranks out these studies. 70% or so are just modeling studies where they tune the models to get whatever result they want. They get the headline, they get the press release, they get the funding, they get bigger staff, they get published, they get invited to UN conferences. Mammals shrink when the earth heats up. This is my favorite. Horses the size of cats. Are you ready for that? Tiny little horses running around. But wait, climate change is also making horses fat because it's causing an abundance of grass. So you're going to have these tiny little horses the size of cats, but they're going to be real fat. So these little fat horses running, fat cat horses. I don't know how it works, but hey, unless you have a PhD in climatology, you can't question the science. You're a denier if you don't accept this. Global warming causes more crime. This is the Los Angeles Times. Climate change brings more crime. And the theory here, by the way, based on their models and UN scientists get involved, is crime goes up in the summer when people are out and about interacting more. Obviously, on a night like tonight in Bismarck, there's probably going to be very little crime. A night in July, there'd probably be more crime. So they get that and they try to extrapolate. A warmer world will equal less crime. So that's what they get. Global warming causes more crime. Climate change will become one of the major forces driving crime as the century progresses. So you ready for that? This is the Washington Post. But wait, this is the New York Times. Lowering crime causes global warming. I'm not making this up. This is the headline. How lowering crime could contribute to global warming. Well, what do they mean? Inmates consume less than the average citizen in the country. So fewer prisoners might mean higher overall energy consumption. Now, scare the hell out of yourself. Think about what a lockdown is. A lockdown is a prison term. We're going to have a lockdown of the inmates. That's what they've been doing with COVID, and we'll get to how they want to do it with climate. But they're saying that the more people let out of prison, when you're in prison, you have a nice small carbon footprint. You can be fed, controlled. Every aspect of your life is regimented and planned. If you get out of prison, oh my gosh, that's horrible for the planet. Your emissions go up. This is the New York Times claiming this. So global warming causes more crime. Reducing crime causes more global warming. And defunding the police is their climate solution. Now, defunding the police is good climate policy. Is this starting to make sense? Because it's not to me. There's no Green New Deal without police abolition. Remember, we're not talking about defunding. There's a movement out there of the Green New Deal AOC types who actually have called openly for police abolition. Now, would that cause more crime or would climate change cause more crime? That's the question. If you disagree with any of this, you're a climate denier, you belong in jail, and that's where Bill Nye, you saw the clip of him earlier, entertaining the idea of jailing climate skeptics for affecting his quality of life. You think NASA is a serious climate agency. Well, NASA, the AGA scientists, the people who put us on the moon. By the way, NASA scientists who put us on the moon started a whole organization about 7 years ago bashing the NASA climate division, saying that they were an embarrassment to NASA, that they're not following the scientific method. The actual engineers from the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s all signed a big petition and formed a group. But this is an example. One of the NASA lead scientists, Dr. Kate Marvel, links climate change to white supremacy, will never head off the catastrophe without dismantling white supremacy, calls for climate racial justice. You thought Al Gore was bad 15 years ago with this movie. He wanted carbon taxes. He wanted people to bicycle to work. Well, now they're telling you that we need racial justice and white supremacy is the cause. This is how wacky the climate movement has gone. The other thing they've done, Christina Figueres is the former climate chief, Obama's energy secretary, Tom Friedman, New York Times. They've all done one thing, praised communist China, one-party rule. This is what they've always liked in the climate movement. China is able to implement policies because its political system avoids the legislative hurdles. There's a couple politicians. I know Senator Kramer was here, and I saw the lieutenant governor earlier, and we have Betty Grandy and other politicians here, elected officials. How many of you want to get rid of those legislative hurdles seen in other countries and follow the Chinese model? Well, guess what? COVID lockdowns have given the progressive left the dream vision of having Chinese-style one-party state in the once free West, where you have unelected bureaucrats dictating every aspect of your life now, and they want to do it for climate. And that's what we're going to talk about here in a minute. But just a little bit more on this. AOC Chief of Staff, this is July 2019, admitted the truth. Remember I showed you earlier they admitted the UN climate had nothing to do with climate. It was about wealth redistribution. Well, gee, I wonder if that applies to the Green New Deal. The interesting thing about the Green New Deal, this is the architect of the Green New Deal, it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. Did you guys think it was a climate thing? Because we really think of it as how do you change the entire economy thing. So the gist of this is they can't sell you these ideas on their merits. They have to pretend there's a climate emergency, pretend we have limited time, we must act now, no time for debate, let's do it. And that's sort of what happened with the COVID lockdowns in terms of, we have to do these lockdowns, we have to do these mandates, it's the only way, or we're gonna have, Spanish flu style deaths. Same thing they've been trying to do with climate, but climate failed for 30, 40 years. COVID succeeded in a matter of weeks in terms of empowering the bureaucracy. Here's what we've walked away from President Trump. Energy dominance. 2019-20, the United States had more energy production than consumption, more energy exports than imports for the first time since Harry Truman was president in 1952. President Biden came in 2021, and he literally shut down America, started with executive orders. He went after extraction, canceling pipelines, Keystone. They went after gas supplies. Within 7 months, they're begging OPEC to increase oil production. We have Russian oil imports now at an 11-year high. We have all these solar and wind mandates that were making us more reliant on China for rare earth mining. And some estimates, 90% of our solar panels are coming from China. So we're now more reliant on hostile regimes for energy, and we're walking away from what we had as American energy dominance for the first time since the 1950s. It was amazing. And now we're heading into a real serious energy shortage. If you want to look at America or our future, look at what's happened in Europe. This was a warning by the UK power chief. Era of constant electricity at home is ending. Families have to get used to power only when it's available. So a rolling lockout situation. To give people an idea of how embedded fossil fuels are in our life, 1908, fossil fuels, 85% of US energy. 2015, 2020, more or less the same. Fossil fuels haven't budged. The last numbers in my book, Green Fraud, solar and wind were less than 4% of energy production, and they somehow want to turn that, and not by not supporting nuclear, but somehow turn that into a net zero future within a matter of a decade, decade and a half, 2 decades, depending on what plan or what mandate they're pushing. Global energy demand means the world will keep burning fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency warns. Unreliables, this is the Keystone Pipeline, could have been underground, this was canceled. Lithium mine for hybrid cars, it's all about the environment. I would urge you to watch, and I have a whole section in this in my book, Green Fraud, the Michael Moore film, Planet of the Humans. He was exiled from Planet of the Progressives for pointing out the folly of the current way they're trying to promote wind and solar in America. And he goes after Al Gore, he goes after Richard Branson. He was literally banned from YouTube, deplatformed, canceled by his allies for decades, that he dared question just this aspect. He's a big believer in climate alarm, he's a big believer in overpopulation, but he doesn't think that solar and wind, the way they're trying to do it with mandates, enforcing this and all the virtue signaling is going to be any way of the solution. It's a powerful documentary. This is one of the great delusions. You plug in and you can see where the actual power is coming from on your hybrid bike or electric car. I mentioned Russian oil imports to America at an 11-year high. The West will have to rely more on what it calls hostile regimes for its supply. What's interesting about this, and of course China's going ahead with coal, estimates 1 a week, but we still have John Kerry telling us climate change is the greatest national security threat. Bonkers, nonsense. The greatest national security threat we have is the climate agenda. Shuts down domestic energy, shuts down domestic energy independence, and makes us reliant on China, makes us reliant on OPEC, makes us reliant on Russia. It is absolutely insane. By the way, China is now moving into the Taliban, moving into Afghanistan through the Taliban. But hey, Newsweek says the Taliban is pledged to fight climate change, so they're obviously better than Donald Trump in their eyes. And it's not Biden's fault that the Taliban rose, because CBS News reported that the Taliban were a result of climate change without even knowing it. So the Taliban's only in power because of climate change. They're going to fight it. Chinese leaders refused to meet with John Kerry in person and Joe Biden, but guess who they met with in person? Taliban leaders, because they want to get their hands on the rare earth minerals in Afghanistan. And it looks like there's going to be a great partnership there between China and the Taliban in Afghanistan, as America, with all these mandates and our own environmental restrictions, are going to be relying more and more on hostile regimes. The UN and government can't regulate the climate. This is the Ivy League geologist Robert Giegengak, 200 peer-reviewed studies. None of the strategies that have been offered by the US government or EPA, UN, anyone else has the remotest chance of altering the climate, even if you believe the climate is controlled by carbon dioxide. And that's the bottom line. You don't even have to get into a scientific debate. Just look at a cost-benefit analysis. Will this even reduce global emissions? John Kerry has admitted multiple times, the climate envoy for Biden, that even if we zeroed out US emissions to nothing, we would still not even impact global emissions, let alone global climate. So this is all a virtue signal in the end. The US, there's been studies looking at the effect if the Green New Deal, as it was envisioned by AOC, were implemented. No temperature impact, barely indistinguishable from zero, according to all the studies when they released the report. So until they can explain why you would want to do this, when their answer invariably is, this is going to improve, it's going to help equity, social justice. So what they do is they pivot and they say, we should support it for these reasons, but that's not the reason when they introduce it. They don't want an actual debate on the merits. They want to scare you, shut down debate, give you a deadline, panic people, and get them supporting it. So ban and centrally plan fracking, light bulb, and what they've done is they've recruited kids. One of the things they do is kids are involved in lawsuits now to fight the government, to ensure their climate future. I'm going to show a clip now from Climate Hustle 2 on the kids being indoctrinated by the climate agenda. So this is a clip now. Climate Hustle 2 came out last year, Kevin Sorbo, and how kids are being indoctrinated into this agenda.
Global warming. Some say irreversible consequences are 30 years away. 30 years? That won't affect me.
Here's little Layla. Take a look.
I really want the polar bears to have food to eat so they won't be hurt, and I don't know how to fix it, and I really want to.
Well, Layla,
cry.
The only way they can keep this storyline alive, given that the facts are now entirely and implacably and inexorably and increasingly against them, is to insist that only the party line be taught in schools.
I don't see any reason to teach kids about this other than to, unless you're trying to, brainwash them in some way, get them when they're young kind of thing.
The climate change education issue, the reason this is so important is because of the influence of the environmental movement and because of their power. What's happening is you are getting one-sided science.
We want our textbooks to reflect the facts. And at this point, climate change and its causes are proven scientific facts. So it makes perfect sense that we would make sure that only the facts are provided to our students.
I'm an AP environmental science teacher, so I teach high school environmental science. And yes, we like to tell our students that the majority of science, all of them in fact, do agree. I wanted to have it smart scientists, 10 out of 10 smart scientists agree.
What is happening with the environmental movement is they're putting children ahead of their parents. You know more than your parents. Your parents are stupid. Your grandparents and your parents have ruined the earth. So it's actually teaching children to be against their parents as well as our political system.
If burning fossil fuels was so bad that it threatened our very existence, how could we just continue like before? To me, that did not add up. It was too unreal. So when I was 11, I became ill. I fell into depression. I stopped talking, and I stopped eating.
It's putting the weight of the world on these children's shoulder, and this is why our children are losing hope.
The Weather Channel recently released this video featuring children as climate activists.
Rising sea levels would displace millions.
97% of scientists agree that global warming started decades ago.
We are astronauts, oh Mama Earth. We are astronauts, don't need no cars. We don't need no CO2. What we need is me and you.
It's basically child propaganda.
They don't understand green is political.
It's not right. We should be teaching children critical thinking.
So yeah, that was a song. I love that, the UN song. There was one of the UN conferences. Kids singing, "We don't need no CO2." Now, first of all, humans inhale oxygen, we exhale CO2. It gives you an idea of what kids are being taught in the United Nations to propagandize them like that. This is what's happening. Kids are today. They've also been recruited by former NASA scientist James Hansen and others to do lawsuits against the government for violating their climate future. We have 60 Minutes profiling these lawsuits, and one of the girls says she woke up and put her ankle in climate change because she lives in Louisiana and her basement flooded, her first floor flooded, which anyone who lives in Louisiana knows there's going to be higher water tables. This is what they call climate change. Any bad thing that happens, and the media's funding, media's promoting it, environmental groups are funding it. There's lawsuits against the European governments as well. Young kids, elementary school, being recruited as, again, in these lawsuits to fight for a climate future. Okay. So we're going to go end with this, the climate lockdowns. This is the future. Again, I mentioned earlier they were jealous at first, and then they wanted to join in on this. The coronavirus has been mutating. This is the new variant. I think it's called the Soviet variant. That's coming. There's actually one called the flu and the one coming together called Florina or something. But oddly prescient, 2015, the former head of the United Nations Climate Division, shutting down the whole economy is the only way of limiting global warming. Now, isn't that weird? Just 5 years before the whole economy was shut down, he was saying it more rhetorically, like the only way we can achieve these goals is to shut down the economy. By the way, at these UN summits, I interviewed activists, and they're featured in my book and film, where they actually talk about planned recessions in order to fight global warming. And what is the Green New Deal really but a planned recession? What is the lockdown, the snap lockdowns and all the restrictions, but essentially government imposing planned restrictions through government bureaucracy? This has actually been a thing for decades called the degrowth movement in the environmental movement. The UK Guardian, this is from last year, global lockdowns every 2 years needed to meet Paris CO2 goals. Say, wow, they're calling it a global lockdown. So in other words, we were locked down for a virus, but hey, how wonderful. This was a great thing. So many people praised the lockdowns, from John Kerry to Greta Thunberg to the UN climate chief, the UN chief, all just saying this has been wonderful for the environment. Soros Gates-funded professor planning climate lockdown. The world may not need to resort to lockdowns again, this time to tackle a climate emergency. And here's what they said. Under a climate lockdown, this is a direct quote from the Soros Gates-funded professor in the UK, Governments would limit private vehicle use, ban consumption of red meat, impose extreme energy-saving measures, while fossil fuel companies would have to stop drilling. To avoid it, we must overhaul our economic structure and do capitalism differently. In other words, do what they say now or this is coming. And this is what they want. This isn't a vote. It's not like Congress is going to vote on this. This is going to be declare a public health emergency, suspend it, and then you could do through executive orders to start shutting stuff down because it's an emergency, just like you did with the virus. Washington Post got into this. I believe there's a Washington Post, yes. We're flattening the coronavirus curve. We can flatten the climate curve too. There were so many articles, just 2 weeks we should try to flatten the climate curve. How many people believe it would be 2 weeks, 2 years? Chuck Schumer urging a national climate emergency by Joe Biden. Biden just last weekend had protesters, climate activists, urging him to declare a national climate emergency. They want a coronavirus-style lockdown nationally. This would empower governors, mayors to start restricting everything you just heard about, transportation, diet, agriculture, energy, vehicles. Democrat candidate Tom Steyer, much more important than that, Democrat funder Tom Steyer, he laid out a plan in 2020 for a climate police state. I will use the executive emergency powers of the presidency to declare a state of emergency, to tell companies how they can generate electricity, what cars they can build, what schedule, what kind of buildings we're going to have, how we're going to use our public lands. Tom Steyer said this, not a blogger on a Greenpeace website. This is Tom Steyer, one of the biggest Democratic donors in the world, in the Democratic Party, saying that he would essentially pull off a 5-year plan or make the trains run on time. Every aspect of energy would be dictated by a government agency. Now, wait a minute. Just think a second. Every aspect of your life was dictated by public health bureaucrats beginning in March 2020, and they have not wanted to relinquish that power. Do you think this would be a temporary power if Tom Steyer gets his way? This is Bloomberg opinion, mainstream media. Once again, I'm not doing some weird source. We must start planning for a permanent pandemic. With coronavirus mutations against vaccinations, we may never go back to normal. So right now, we know they don't want to go back to normal with COVID. They want to make climate the next thing. Klaus Schwab, founder of the World Economic, the world must act jointly and swiftly to revamp all aspects of our society. We need a, quote, great reset of capitalism. This is what the billionaire group, the Davos World Economic Forum, and by the way, this is the topic of my next book that comes out this summer, 2022, The Great Reset, the Permanent Pandemic, how they're using COVID climate crisis to essentially take us into a new world of a one-party state like China where unelected officials dictate every part. They're going to make it, their goal is to make it so it won't matter who you vote for governor, senator, president. You're going to have a permanent bureaucratic administrative state that's going to wield most of the power, and elected officials will be increasingly less and less able to undo it. Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, this pandemic, COVID, has provided an opportunity for a reset. We need to reimagine economic systems by building back better. Again, these are major world leaders. Time magazine, the pandemic remade every corner of society. Now it's climate's turn. In other words, if you've liked your life in the last 2 years with government mandates, restrictions, stay-at-home orders, canceling weddings, funerals, making it difficult to travel, mandates of all kinds, it's not too bad here, but imagine like if you lived in New York State or California. Time magazine is saying basically it's climate's turn. This has been great. It's remade every corner of society. Now let's let climate do it. Climate lockdowns. A study claimed Americans need to cut their energy use 90%, live in 640 square feet, fly once every 3 years, limit new clothing, plant-based diet, collective transport, universal basic income, and the degrowth movement. Now, this was a team of European research, University of Leeds, published in the journal Global Environmental Change. Once again, not some obscure website. This is not, some bizarre environmental groups, some ranting, and I'm trying to say this is a mainstream academic journal, major university in Europe, promoting this. Should everyone have their own personal carbon quota? Calls grow for emission allowances. This is UK Independent. Fight climate change with every swipe. The United Nations, I can now tell you, this is actually, this is a new credit card. This is it's called the One Card, zero carbon footprint. Plant a tree every time you make a purchase. They're now advocating that credit card companies monitor your bills, determine what your carbon footprint is, and guess what? The United Nations and MasterCard have joined up, new CO2 monitoring card. This came out in September, announced. enables tracking of your footprint on every purchase, monitors, cuts off spending when you hit your carbon max. Now, this is frightening because at this point in time, if you don't get vaccinated in some cities, you don't get vaccinated in some countries from COVID, they are stopping people's access to banking, your ability to actually even have accounts. They're trying to punish people gleefully. And General Flynn, President Trump's former national security advisor, was actually taken off of a visa because they didn't want to associate with his politics. We've had other countries, again, cut off banking access. So this is really scary. This is voluntary now. It's an option. But imagine when corporate America teams up with climate activists, how long is this going to be optional? The 2021 International Energy Agency, major energy agency, global, that's respected, mainstream, reports to the net zero report urged behavioral changes to fight climate change. Here they are, quote, a shift away from private car use, upper speed limits, thermostat controls in your house, limits on hot water. Once again, this is not Alex Jones conspiracy theory. This is mainstream reports on what they're planning, they're telling you. UK funded report 2019, government report, absolute zero. Stop flying, no new roads, airport closures, stop eating beef, lamb, stop doing anything that causes emissions, regulate carbon dioxide similar to asbestos. Humans exhale CO2 from our mouth. What we exhale from our mouth will be regulated like asbestos. Think about that for a moment. New Zealand covert expert. We can do this for other diseases that we have here in New Zealand. We can do it for climate change. Why wouldn't we do this for other things? They are openly saying it on mainstream, this is mainstream TV in New Zealand, the head COVID person just bragging that they want to do this for climate next. We can do it for climate change. Journal Nature, premier scientific journal of the climate environmental world. COVID lockdowns are key to begin personal carbon allowances. Quote, these are quotes, restrictions on individuals that were unthinkable only a year before have prepared us to accept tracking and limitations to achieve a safer climate. You're not doing it, you're not locking down to save grandma, you're locking down to save the climate now. Climate lockdowns. British Medical Journal, as prestigious as you get, calls for meat, dairy price hikes to fight climate change. Meat consumption in North America must fall 79%. And by the way, substantial fewer journeys by car. Watch Jane. Now, Jane Fonda has been watching all this. She's a Green New Deal. I interviewed her in Washington, D.C. She was protesting or lobbying for the Green New Deal. COVID is God's gift to the left. That's the quiet part said out loud, and she couldn't have been more right. COVID response, a template for climate. This is climate is the greatest threat to global public health. Say 230 medical journals. They declared the COVID-19 response to be template for a climate response. 230 medical journals around the world are in sync on this. November 2021, paper published in the prestigious journal, a political journal, Laments Democracy, calls for authoritarian environmentalism modeled after COVID lockdowns to fight a climate emergency. This, by the way, the author of this paper, I did this story on New Year's Eve. He ended up promoting on Twitter calls to get me removed from Twitter for just, and I didn't say any comments, I just quoted his words here. And it's now getting all over the globe, this story in this journal that people had missed. But this is what happens. The author of the paper wants me banned on Twitter and is openly promoting that. Scientists warn on affluence. Study, wealth harms the planet. Solutions, degrowth, eco-socialism, banning oversized vehicle, maximum income levels. June 2020, Lund University, to halt climate change, we need an ecological Leninism, and not John Lennon from the Beatles. He's talking about Vladimir Lenin from the Soviet Union. State power should definitely be used to ban SUVs and private jets. I'll get to this. You're hearing this about transportation, cars. Anthony Fauci, how many of you knew this? COVID-19 is due to the extreme backlash from nature, will require changes in human behavior, other radical changes. Anthony Fauci talking about climate change, not COVID. Rebuilding the infrastructure of human existence. Anthony Fauci, rebuilding the infrastructure of human existence for climate change in this paper. And there's the academic paper, Emerging Pandemic, how do we how we got to COVID-19. Hey, but guess what? Big banks and everyone, Morgan Stanley, they're all in too. Infectious diseases are on track to be a significant consequence of climate change. Are you afraid of COVID? Well, you better solve climate, because climate's going to cause a lot more COVIDs. Only fly when morally justifiable. People must make a declaration as to why they need to travel. You can't fly commercial unless it's morally justifiable. This is what Eric Holtheist, major climate activist, is proposing. You have to have a legitimate reason. You're going to Florida? I'm sorry, you can't go there unless it's for a funeral, a wedding, and by the way, only one wedding every 3 years. This is what they're looking for. They love this idea. And it's the same thing with a vaccine passport. It's probably the biggest tipping point in our whole battle right now. If vaccine passports make it in New York and California, start spreading, that's going to be the way this is all enforced, because they're basically saying you be obedient to the state or you don't get to do anything. G7 leaders announced plan to phase out gasoline cars. This is earlier this year. This is coming. Andrew Yang ran for mayor in New York, ran for Democrat. He imagines banning private car ownership, elimination, and instead making people rely on a constant roving fleet of rental electric cars you would just order up. You don't need a private car. Canadian magazine, July of last year, shift away from relying on private vehicles entirely. This is the Daily Mail. UK transport minister, owning a car is outdated 20th century thinking. How many here have outdated 20th century thinking? A lot of you. Okay, you guys are last century. Business Insider, you'd think, oh, Business Insider, this is a good publication. It must be, pro-business. Electric cars won't save us. We need to get rid of cars completely. Oh, that makes sense, I guess. Well, many of us are aware, this is the World Economic Forum praising this idea of locking down with credit cards. It cuts off your spending when we hit the carbon max. The World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, great reset of capitalism. Love the idea of you not being able to spend any more money if you've used too much. So first they came for your energy, then your car, and now houses pose a more danger to the climate than vehicles. They want you living in essentially tenement housing, high rises, small pads, smaller and smaller. All the key to all these reports that I've gone through, they want your living size to keep shrinking. What could be next? Your kids. Is having a baby in 2021 pure environmental vandalism? How many have engaged in environmental vandalism? Let me see here. A lot of you. Okay, you're allowed. This is you're eco-terrorists by having kids. What could be next? Gore's quest to become a fake meat billionaire. Al Gore released an IPO, one of the biggest IPOs in 2019, timed to a UN report on agriculture and how meat eating was causing the climate catastrophe. He invested $2 million in fake meat substitutes. This is coming next. Bill Gates buying up American farmland, the #1 owner, according to NBC News. The Great Diet Reset, the World Economic Forum promoting fake meat from a printer. I'm not even sure how this works. Machines print up to 6 kilograms of meat an hour. And this is the actual screenshots. Scientists in Israel are creating plant-based meat that has fat, blood, and muscle. It's all processed vegetable oil meat that even a CNN nutritionist said was not healthy and would not, it's not necessarily the way to go. And people want to eat it, that's fine. But this is about making meat expensive, forcing people. So imagine like, hey, what's for dinner tonight? Well, I'm just printing up some meat. They'll be ready in a little bit here, honey. Hang on, this is what we're facing. So the other thing that's absurd is you go to a doctor. This has happened this last few months. A British Columbia doctor clinically diagnosed a patient as suffering from climate change. Historic first, the first patient known. Again, not an obscure doctor. Major hospital in British Columbia, head of the emergency room department, not some med student who's on a blog trying to get attention. This is real, it's happening, these are mainstream figures. They clinically diagnosed the patient, he picked up the patient's chart, penned the word climate change because she had dehydration and heat exhaustion. So you know how CNN and everyone loves the COVID death tolls? Climate death tolls. Climate change is a killer, but we don't acknowledge it on death certificates. Academics are calling for climate change to be listed as a cause of death. Certificate of death, cause of death, climate change. Bill Gates warns of this. The actual death toll from climate will be much, much greater than we've had with COVID. Climate change makes children vulnerable to infectious disease. So if you don't fight climate change, you're killing kids. CNN is just waiting. The James O'Keefe video, the CNN executive, they're waiting to switch to climate change. You can see it right there. That's a made up. I mean, we scratched it out, but you see, that should say COVID, but we added climate because that's what they want to do. Car crashes equal. The federal government, Department of Transportation, global warming could cause more deadly car crashes. Cancer equals a climate death. American Cancer Society, climate change is increasing cancer risk. And by the way, American Cancer Society frets over the carbon footprint of cancer care. How many people would want to go to a doctor who, if you have cancer, who would worry about the carbon footprint of the treatment they give you before they give it to you. This is the world in which we're living now. Gore has warned, every organ system can be affected by climate change. So if you follow the science, if you die from cancer, car accident, or organ failure, you could be listed as a death from climate change. The reality, of course, destroys this. After 100 years of climate-related deaths, they've approached zero, 99% drop since 1920. How does the mainstream media handle this? Climate change causes 5 million extra deaths a year. This is just last summer. But wait a minute, look at the part underlined here. Global temperatures rose, but look at the bottom, with most deaths caused by cold exposure. They buried the lead. Cold kills anywhere from 8 to 16 to 20 times, depending on what number, but cold kills people, not the heat. But you see how they call cold and hot climate change and 5 million, and then they have to, for journalistic objectivity and accuracy, most deaths were caused by cold exposure. You must talk to your doctor before. This may cause side effects. So, why have we been so compliant? Well, I think we have the answer. Go back to 1941. A professor, I believe it was the University of Cincinnati, came out and said that warmer temperatures led to the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. They could explain, I'm saying they could explain the acceptance of COVID lockdowns. People are more docile and easily led in warm weather. That was the theory in 1941. So maybe the climate change we've experienced, the warming we've had since the end of the Little Ice Age, has made us more docile, and it allowed Mussolini, Hitler, and of course the public health authoritarianism. So in closing, you must keep calm, trust the experts. Unless you have a PhD in epidemiology or climate, you can't question lockdowns. You can't question what's best for your kids in school. You're not a doctor. You don't have the public health expertise. You're not a climate scientist. You can't oppose, the Green New Deal. This is what they want you to think. The New York Times says, critical thinking leads to misinformation. Don't go down the rabbit hole. And by the way, that's what it says. Critical thinking, as we're taught, isn't helping in the fight against misinformation. Don't critically think. Forbes, you must not do your own research when it comes to science. Why would you? Whatever Anthony Fauci or the World Health Organization in bed with China says, accept it. Whatever the UN says, accept it. Questioning authority has become too much of a good thing, and it's killing people. Remember when progressives in the 1960s, 70s, the Pentagon Papers fighting the Vietnam War, question authority, don't accept this, Richard Nixon, King Richard, the pig. Now if you question authority, you are a reactionary, right-wing fascist, because you're killing people if you question authority. So you disagree with the UN, the World Health, CDC, you're killing people. So now Slate magazine has the real solution. It's time to just give up on facts, at least temporarily. How about 2 weeks to give up on facts, lay them down in favor of a more useful weapon? Are you ready? Emotions. Why would you critically evaluate lockdowns or any COVID restrictions or the Green New Deal's impact or UN when you could just scare the hell out of people with emotions? Slate has it down, and it's brilliant. And by the way, John Stossel had a lawsuit against Facebook for his fact check, and Facebook, in a court filing about a month ago, admitted that fact checks are actually nothing more than opinions. So that was a huge thing. That's going to have huge ramifications on this whole nonsense. But Facebook admitted that their fact checks are merely opinions. This is what's happening right now with mainstream media. And this is one of the funny things. Are you sure this will bring rain? This is the Aztecs. Organ sacrifices, all sorts of things they've done over the years, the witch trials. People have been trying to control the weather for centuries. And I'll end the talk with this. How should you talk to your friends and relatives who believe conspiracy theories? My solution right here. Hey, bro, you were right about everything. I'm sorry. 2020 and 2021 were the year conspiracy realities outnumbered conspiracy theories. And that, to me, this says up the whole thing, whether you're talking COVID, climate, lockdowns, United Nations. This is it, because everything that we've warned, they're now openly saying and doing. And again, if you go back, my presentation, everything I presented, 95% was all mainstream media sources, scientific journals, medical journals. Nothing I did. People will always try to say, oh, you're picking obscure blogs from people, blah, blah. Not at all. You can check the sources. My PowerPoint is available for anyone. I work for CFACT.org, Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. My website is Climate Depot. My other book is Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. And you can reach me at that email address. And I'd be happy to take question and answer. I have books in the back and some movie copies of the original Climate Hustle 2016, a couple of Climate Hustle 2, and audio books of Politically Incorrect, and a couple of green fraud books. So thank you so much. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you to Be Truthful, and thank you, Lori.